discuss Hurricane Sandy and the mold remediation projects that are occurring and the safe remediation of mold in these homes by both workers and volunteers. I want to thank the NIHS for supporting this by the Hazardous Materials Training Center, as well as the NIOSH-funded ERCs, as well as, of course, New Jersey Training Center and HRSA. The University of Medicine and Dentistry in Piscataway is a funded program. We've been here many years doing training, and I'm happy to be here doing this webinar for you today. Before we start, I want to just have you look at the top bubble where it says click here. You can ask questions anytime. They will be stored in a queue. At the end of the presentation, we will proceed to answer these sequentially as fast as we can. It's about a 45-minute presentation followed by questions for a total of about 1 hour. So please, I recommend you type your questions while they're fresh in your head so we can get to as many as we can. That's the point of this webinar. Okay, so these are some of the points I want to cover. Where does mold come from and how it grows? Some quick basics on mold biology. I also want to cover identifying and assessing a mold-contaminated home, a situation, as related to Hurricane Sandy in particular. I also will briefly comment on exposure and health effects. Of course, that's why we're here, because of the concerns of adverse health effects of mold. Finally, the bulk of the content today will be on remediation methods, past and present, various guidelines from different agencies, followed by overview of personal protective equipment, what is the minimum respiratory protection, and how we can make sure that we don't create more disease in this particular response. So with that, let me just go over some slides on the particular episode. I don't have to tell you how disastrous this was. Entire boardwalks were lifted and brought inland, Jersey Shore as well as Coney Island. We had tremendous amounts of sand and all sorts of materials mixed up in the sand. So this response was devastating. 90,000 homes just in New York. Another 15,000 on Long Island, and of course tens of thousands on the Jersey Shore. Tremendous economic disaster. But I think I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I want to just clarify something here, because this is rather unique, because the different areas, New Jersey, Coney Island, New York, Long Island, all have different homes. The photo you're looking at on the left, you'll see a small beige home that was practically underwater. The home to the right of that, a brick building, the water was just about to the top of the automobile. And to the far right, another beige home in the corner, because it was rather, it's an older housing, was also submerged. So when people say their basements were flooded, trust me, entire homes were underwater, first floors were flooded. So it's not as simple as I'll live upstairs while I clean downstairs. I just want to state that, because Katrina was a little different, more homogeneous housing. This is very, very heterogeneous housing, including apartment buildings and public housing. The devastation, of course, is amazing. This slide was taken by me, and I was shocked. 4 air conditioners, a refrigerator, a washer dryer, over and over and over. So I think this is no surprise how much personal loss is occurring. And we want to make sure the mold problem here isn't going to add yet another huge personal loss. So let's go over mold biology briefly. Mold is abundant. It's everywhere, including cheeses, including breads. It's just waiting to grow. Thousands of species, including yeast and fungi and mushrooms and truffles. You know that freshly baked bread in a few days, if it stays moist, will grow mold. Many of you notice this black material on onions. That's Aspergillus niger. It's always there. It's in the soil, and at some point it will start growing. If you want to grow it more, just keep your onions in a plastic bag, and you'll see how quickly the mold growth will continue. There are many species out there. Cladosporium is a very common outdoor mold. It likes colder temperatures, and it seems to be a dominant mold that's growing out in the homes because many of the homes are still cold. We have Aspergillus and various species there, penicillium, and of course Stachybotrys, Alternaria. I want to get away from saying the word toxic mold. The public health, I think, consensus is that mold exposure of any type should be minimized. They have triggers with allergies, asthma. Very high organic loads are putting a stress on the respiratory system. So you will not hear me use the phrase toxic mold too much. I prefer to think that we need to get all these exposures down. But what we do have in this situation is actively growing mold cultures, not mold fragments. And my point being here is that mold spores are pretty big, 1 to 10 microns. And very often the filter media, both in HEPA filters or N95s, are adequate to catch these large particles. P100s, that extra 5%, is of very small particles, and those would be mold fragments. But what we have here are large growing colonies of mold, and the mold spores, of course, the seeds are what we're especially concerned about because they can be aerosolized and inhaled. So going over the growth cycle of mold, as I said, it's abundant. It's on our clothes, in my hair, on all sorts of semi-porous and porous substances, and it's just waiting to grow. Plenty of food. It needs carbon. Mold will not grow on ceramic tile. It will grow in the grout of ceramic tiles because there's organic matter in that grout and moisture is held and it starts to grow. But it does need carbon. Plenty of that. Plenty of temperature. So the only thing holding mold back, of course, is moisture. Add a little moisture, keep it wet at a certain range, and mold will find the ideal conditions to hatch and grow and reproduce at tremendous amounts. Therefore, what we generally assess is moisture levels. Now, you don't need a moisture meter to see a house is underwater or flooded. Sometimes you could just touch it. But in the profession, we do have moisture meters that help us determine when the material is dry enough. And you may have heard me say over and over, we need to get the material completely back to normal dry before we reconstruct these homes. There are several types of moisture meters. In this particular field, I believe probably the conductive type, the pin-based, are fine. The mold investigator, my good friend John Tiffany, who taught me a lot about mold, will tell you that a electromagnetic conductive meter will measure mold behind sheetrock and subsurface, which can be very important because the sheetrock may seem dry, but behind that it's quite wet. But it seems most of this time, most of what we're seeing, a simple pin type is adequate. And there are some ranges you may want. You may see the number 12%, which seems pretty common. And in this particular slide, you see that just for a demo, measuring moisture meetings on the bottom, over 40%. Very often these machines peak out at about 40. And as you move up, the numbers get lower and lower. As a matter of fact, if you look at the slide on the right, you will see a very high dense mold growth towards the bottom and middle of the beam. And as you go up, it quite distinctly tails off. Mold follows water in a certain range. No more water, no more mold. Too much water, no mold. So it's very, very fascinating to look at these cultures and understand the biology. With regard to identifying mold, we don't need much air sampling. It's out there. You could see the fuzzy colonies. If you touch them, you could actually feel the powdery mycelium and conidia that is dislodged, easily dislodged, almost a slimy feeling also. And of course, many of us know that if your olfactory sense is up to speed, you could smell the microbial volatile organic compounds that mold releases, this sort of earthy smell. On my nose, I can never smell mold, so unfortunately that doesn't work for me. I do want to say that mold will grow on different media differently. So you cannot look at a culture plate like this and easily say, oh, the mold in N is Aspergillus. You really do need to look at the spores themselves. So what I'm saying is penicillin growing on sheetrock, a couch, or malt extract agar will look differently, will grow differently, both morphologically and, of course, the color. So don't have anyone tell you, oh, gee, that's cladosporium just by looking at it. It's not quite that simple. However, the mold testing that you will hear about, and I'm saying this because it's starting to pop out in our experience with Hurricane Sandy, is by and large spore counts. The device on the right, the aerosol, is the commonly used spore trap. This is impacting material onto a sticky matrix where the spores will adhere due to impaction, and then taken to a laboratory where a mycologist will identify both how many spores and what type of spores. If you're sampling an actively growing culture, such as what's happening in the Jersey Shore or Long Island, you will probably deduce that these are entire mold spores and not fragments. Spore counts generally do not differentiate between viable and non-viable. So you get some very high numbers. The other one, colony forming units, is a 5-day test. You essentially are inoculating a plate, growing, and when cultures are visible and big enough, you identify them and characterize them. So these are the two counts out there. And I just want to show you that the numbers are crazy. In just this slide in front of you taken the other day in St. Louis shows spore counts of over 50,000 spores per cubic meter in St. Louis. This varies by wind, by what's growing in that area. So I guess what you're hearing me say is we have adapted and grown with spores in our environment. Now that doesn't mean we need to be living in huge quantities day in and day out, but this is not like asbestos or other contaminants where we have not evolved with. So I think that was a quick summary of mold microbiology. Forgive me if I missed some points here. We could do a whole seminar on just that. But let's get into the meat of mold remediation at Sandy and what has really happened there. These 4 steps logically progressed, but in some places it was all one shot, meaning the removal of the furnishings, the wet furnishings, what's called muck out. Many volunteers have donated time and strength to lift out couches and get the stuff out of the house. I suspect 95% from what I've been asking, there is probably not many houses that have not done a muck out, a furniture removal. Number 2 is demolishing the walls. This takes a little bit more time. It obviously is construction, ripping out ceilings, floors, getting down to the bare studs. After that, we would like to clean the area and remediate any mold that's there. And I think at this point I would say it's there in probably the vast, vast majority of homes, 90%, and this is just a professional guess. And of course, step number 5, which is not here, is rebuilding. But that's a long time away, so let's not get there. Concurrent to all of this is drying out the home. So the professionals are telling us, and it's good advice, to quickly dry out the home. A small home dehumidifier is probably good for a closet. However, a 65-pint, 70-pint dehumidifier will be better for a room. You can't get much bigger than that at the home improvement stores. And they're expensive, $100 to $200, and they're difficult in cold weathers. These units work better in a hot climate. So dehumidifiers are very good. but there are professional companies that will come in and completely dry a home out in as little as 2 to 3 days, depending on where exactly the moisture is, whether it's first floor or basement. What happens after a few days is the spores will, of course, forgive me, hatch, and they grow. 1 makes 2, makes 4, makes 8, on and on and on logarithmically. And, of course, they're releasing byproducts, all sorts of compounds, microbial VOCs, and this is what you're smelling. So you could dry clean your socks and your pants and your gym clothes with that musty odor, but a couch is just not possible. So that's why if it has been wet for 2 days, and I believe perhaps even less than that, you have germinated these spores and they are producing MVOCs, wetting the material, and it will have that musty odor. If you can't get it out in 2 days, if you can't totally dry it in 2 days, it's now on the sidewalk, as you see. As you walk around the community, you'll see products on the street. You may say, what brought this mold here? And the reality is it's always been on this wood. Contrary to some things I've heard, people think that maybe the ocean brought this stuff into the homes, deposited it there, and now we have to demoldify the house. We have to remove it. But no, it's always been in the wood, and it just has a chance to grow, and that's what you're seeing on this nice piece of pine, very soft wood, very porous, and grows very quickly. So the muck-out has continued. This material is quickly disposed of. Some has mold, some doesn't. These are early pictures a week or so after. Because of the cold temperature, because of the salt water, because of the biology, we did not see much mold in the first 2 to 3 weeks. But now that the temperatures of the homes are being reheated and some of the mold spores are growing, we are seeing construction material like this with colonies on it. Okay, so you've got mold. Well, the reality is we have a lot of experience in the U.S. with this. This is not the first flood. Obviously, Katrina has taught us a lot. Hurricane Irene last year, upstate, taught us a lot. Mold remediation in New York City, in New Jersey, in Philadelphia has been on and on. Homes get flooded accidentally, washer and dryers, insurance companies hire professionals to assess and remediate. So again, this is not new. As a matter of fact, OSHA and many federal agencies have been very active, and I particularly want to commend OSHA for its rapid response, Region 2 OSHA, for its rapid response in producing some nice documents, including a worker protection sort of grid on all the hazards. They also, last week, produced a mold hazards during Hurricane Sandy cleanup. Perfect timing for this presentation. Obviously, a lot of what I am going to say follows this, which has been, these are typical practices that we've used. NIOSH, of course, concerned with health effects, has documents on the health effects of moisture in buildings. And I encourage you to search for these documents. They're readily available. And Dr. Mitch Rosen at UMDNJ and myself and others would be happy to help you find these materials and disseminate them. Obviously, I can't not mention New York City's very progressive and admirable mold guidelines, recently modified in 2008. A very nice document, guidelines for the assessment and remediation of fungi in indoor environments. This is on their website. They're constantly updating this and making it simpler for communities, residents, and volunteers to extract the information they need. It's a good document. Please look these over. And, of course, New Jersey has, within its Department of Health and Senior Services, documents on mold and mold assessment. In particular, New Jersey does have a list of mold remediation companies. There is no national certification for these titles. Unlike asbestos inspector, asbestos worker, lead inspector, certified industrial hygienist, these titles, well established, very often in law, we are not at the point where there is a one recognized certification. We encourage people to look for people that have experience and training in this area. With 115,000 homes that have been saturated or partially saturated, it's going to be hard to get all those companies involved. And that's why this presentation is really intended for some of the volunteers and the homeowners to do their work. All of these approaches have been very, very consistent. And I tried hard preparing for today's seminar to sort of do a grid and say, well, they say this, OSHA says this, New York City says that, Massachusetts says this. But it is not a heavily regulated area where the specifications are like the asbestos world, where you have 2 layers of polyethylene sheeting and 6 inches of overlap and on and on and on, negative air. These are guidelines, so everything we say today is essentially from practical experience and various guidelines. The common threads here are protecting yourself, isolating the material, ventilating the space, and by ventilating meaning negative pressure. While you do the work, you're going to release spores, and these spores may migrate to other parts of the house. These spores don't cause cancer. They don't cause distinct diseases. There's a difficult dose response. We don't have established epidemiology, but the consensus is this organic loading, these spores are generally not healthy, and we want to keep exposure to a minimum. So therefore, keeping this material confined. There are some safe practices to use during the removal, and I'll go over some of these. Ultimately, what we're doing, if you cannot remove the sheetrock, or I'm sorry, if you cannot remove the studs, which seems to be the big issue in this episode, is to scrub off the mold. And we'll show you pictures on that. Disinfection. I will have a whole discussion on disinfection, so we'll talk about that. And again, let me just repeat over and over, we must dry out the house, because if you do mold remediation and there's still moisture, 15-20%, it's going to come right back. So in some ways, the goal is to remove what's growing and dry it out before it gets a chance to come back. Do not try to produce a mold-free house. It is impossible, and it never was mold-free. Okay. And of course, for some of these homes, there may be so much damage that you really need to hire someone who's been in the business and can do this thoroughly. So we'll talk about that. So what are people using? What have people used? And of course, Backpack HEPA-Vacs, high-efficiency particulate air filter vacuum cleaners, which now many of your household vacuum cleaners at your at stores will say HEPA, or high efficiency. So this is as a result of the asbestos revolution of technology, and now we have Backpack HEPA filters that are $200, $300. Rather affordable compared to what was out there years back. The reason they're backpack is just they're easy to lug around and makes getting around the area simpler. I do want to caution you, though, that a vacuum cleaner sucks air in and blows air out. So there's a natural disturbance of the air with a vacuum cleaner. And I'm always concerned because we don't want to generate more material. I have different colleagues that tell me different practices they do with regard to scraping it, then vacuuming it, then scraping it, vacuum what you can, and then dry it all out. So there are some discrepancies and different practices going on. But these vacuums usually come with attachments that allow you to thoroughly scrape the material and essentially capture all the mycelium, all the mold colonies that are growing above the surface of the substrate. Another common practice is the use of handheld scrapers, not really paint spatulas. I'm talking about wood scrapers that actually can get down and thoroughly scrape the colonies off the wooden structures. As you dry the material, it's possible you may be able to use orbital sanders or high-powered sanders that are shrouded with hoods for HEPA vac to actually get some of this stuff off. But essentially what we're doing is scraping the wood studs as clean as we can. Now, in scraping the material, once it's collected, would be disposed of. And the use of bleach, I'll comment on that later, so I don't want to get into it right now. But I have seen people with a scrub brush literally using soap and water to clean the material if it's not well impregnated into the wood. So if it's on the surface and you can use a towel wetted in soap and water and wiping it off, then throwing that towel away, getting a new towel, damping it, wringing it out as dry as you can, and wiping it down, that may be adequate enough. Every situation may be different in this particular case. You see the work on the left here using a sander, a fairly high-powered sander, to literally scrape a 1/16 of an inch of wood off this particular stud. I'm a little nervous about that. I am troubled with do we want to keep it wet or dry? Now, you heard me say dry the area to stop any further mold growth. But the reality is wetting the surface a little will keep the spore counts down and make removal, dry scraping, easier. If you completely dry it out and then use these methods you see here, you're actually going to get fairly high dust levels that may trigger a higher level of worker protection. Now, these workers are wearing fairly high-level worker apparatus, full-phase APRs, P100 filters, and that's because they're abatement workers. This is all they do day in and day out are clean homes. So it's a different scenario here. Wetting the material is generally done by a spray. It could be a handheld sprayer, soap and water. Why soap? It's a surfactant. It basically will allow better penetration into the mold cultures as opposed to just beating up. So you do want to put a little soap in there to get better penetration of the material. And you probably don't need something like a fogger. The work on the right is using a large-scale fogging spray, which produces a bit of a mist, which captures particles. Very common in the asbestos world. I don't think in our particular situation this is really quite applicable. But you will see Hudson sprayers or 3-gallon sprayers with this. And, of course, here's our favorite topic, disinfection. I could definitely do a whole seminar on just this particular topic. But let me first say that these are words that are regulated by many people, FDA, EPA. The word disinfectant means killing, rendered where it can no longer produce. So when you disinfect the surface, you're essentially sterilizing that surface. Nothing can grow. Sanitizing is reducing the microbial load to an acceptable level. So a sanitizer and a disinfectant are two different materials. It's very often a question of porosity. So we have asked, people have asked us saying, I want to disinfect my china that was underwater. How should I do that? And I'm tempted to say, well, put it in the dishwasher under the sanitized cycle, that hot temperature cycle that many dishwashers have, and that will be good enough between the soap and the hot water. And, of course, I was advised that they don't have a dishwasher anymore and they can't do that. So various chemical disinfectants like chlorine, like ammonium, like what other aldehydes, alcohol wipes, right? You disinfect your hands using alcohol wipes and gels, would work on hard surfaces. When it comes to porous surfaces, that's a very complicated issue because the material will penetrate into wood, kill what's on top, and essentially stop. Because when chlorine kills something, it converts to chloride and no longer works. So it's not like there's a residual of material that will keep that area clean forever. And of course, the spores live in the wood and they'll grow back. I often use the analogy of a tree, where what you're looking at is really the trunk and the branches. The leaves would be the spores, you can't see those, and the roots would go into the wood and you can't see those. So the analogy there is by putting chlorine on a surface, you're essentially killing the tree and the leaves, but the roots are still there and it's going to come back. Keep in mind that EPA registers all pesticides, and by pesticides this is a fungicide, mildew, all these materials have to be registered. If it does not have an EPA registration number on the back, it is not approved for that material. So we've seen a lot of products out there that people are using that are really being misused, and people may be defrauded in some of these efforts. Obviously, Clorox will say right there, disinfects. That's a key word. On the back, there's an EPA registration number. Concrobium is also a mildewcide, fungicide. It works a little differently. It actually coats the material. It's more of a sanitizing agent, but it is an EPA-registered material. To my knowledge, and if there's some EPA colleagues listening, there are very few, if any, consumer available spray disinfectants, meaning I could spray something in the air and it disinfects the air. This is not a wise public health action. For maybe commercial operations like a bomb, a fungicide bomb, or a insecticidal bomb, yes. But for consumers, we generally see liquids that are put on towels that you wipe surfaces with. Even the sprays you see there are meant to be applied to a surface and then wiped clean. Also, we're noticing there are many mold remediation companies coming out, especially following an episode like this, and I just want to remind people that New York State DEC must you must apply for permission to use biocides, commercial biocides, even if it's something as simple as Clorox. If it's for commercial use, homeowners don't need to do that, of course. New Jersey has regulations on the same. So these mold remediation companies, if they are using biocides, also have to be approved, registered, licensed pesticide applicators. A little point of information that some people forget. And look, the consensus, or maybe my consensus, but many people will tell you they're not necessary. These materials may be good for disinfection of hard surfaces, glass, windows, counters, making sure maybe the sewage that may have been in the floodwaters, which may have microbial material in it, is cleaned and disinfected. But when it comes to mold, we don't need it. Again, it's always been there. It will always be there. We just have to stop it from growing. Finally, I just want to warn you, I have heard a lot about this product. I know people are using it. This is a horrible product. I hope I don't get sued for that. For use as a fungicide. It's very good if you want to inoculate, let me just go back, if you want to inoculate your compost heap and get it working well. This is essentially a solution of microbes, and people are saying these microbes eat mold. So spray more microbes in an aqueous solution on mold to kill the mold. Okay, so I don't have to finish that thought, right? You see the problem there. But the reality is it's not an EPA-registered product. It's a misapplication, and we don't need that. Finally, I don't have it in this slide, but vinegar. Vinegar changes the pH. Mold don't like changes in pH. They will stop growing until the pH is restored to normality. So using vinegar, a natural material, may stop the mold from growing. It may actually kill the surface content, but it, again, is not, none of this is really necessary. I think that's what you're hearing me say. So let's talk about these various areas. The New York City guidelines, various federal guidelines, Massachusetts, others will rank these into different quantities of contamination. So what we have in these areas are homes that are essentially gutted out down to the studs, and now the wood studs have mold growth on it. So that's essentially what we have. Subflooring is also included, maybe on the ceiling, and I'll show you some pictures. So the question is, how much contamination is there, and of course, who's doing it? So these are some of the practices. You could play this recording over and over, so I don't want to read every sentence here. It's a summary of much of what I've been saying, and I'll let you go there. But you will notice that the N95, N meaning non-oil, and 95 meaning 95% efficient at 0.3 micron particles and above, of which most spores are much larger than that, is perfectly adequate. Encourage training on this. I encourage proper clothing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But by and large, homeowners who are doing this at a small scale and volunteers that are doing it as a small scale for a few months do not need that high level of protection. Again, this is not asbestos. We don't have strong epidemiology. We don't have epidemiology on dose response for this type of material. It's a very complicated material, but there is enough to urge caution. Medium-sized jobs, 10 to 100 square feet, all the precautions get bumped up, maybe a little negative air, better vacuum, sealing the areas, ventilation, and followed by large areas, and this may require the use of elastomeric respirators, P100, what you see many of the asbestos workers using, full suits, maybe even a decon site, depending on the quantity you're disturbing. Again, a lot of our experiences from homes that were flooded and now nothing was done and the insurance company is paying for remediation. So people come in and the sheetrock already has a lot of mold. These jobs now, post-Hurricane Sandy, are the materials are on the street, they're gone, and we're down to bare studs. So it's a different type of response, but still one that needs to be done safely and properly to prevent any further harm. Large jobs also, one of our concerns is taking people out of harm's way, specifically immunocompromised individuals, children with asthma, allergies, adults with respiratory conditions. It makes total sense to take these populations outside of the exposure zone, and of course large jobs, that means perhaps complete relocation if they can't move to a different level, depending on the house. So you can read on and on here. I want to show you some pictures as we head to our close here. The materials left dry, visibly clean. And of course, how do you know it's clean? Well, this is a difficult situation. We are working with groups that will come in and do moisture readings to ensure the area is completely clean. Honestly, it may take months for an area to be completely dried out and ready to be rebuilt. I would say, I know it's a very difficult sentence to say, but 2 months. If you could clean out your home, remove the mold, the volunteers, workers, then let it sit there and dry out thoroughly, and then in springtime look for a nice renovation. Do not rebuild until the home has been really tested for moisture content in all areas. Otherwise, this problem will come back, and it will be very costly then because the mold will be hidden behind the walls. OSHA produced a very nice grid following activities from the hurricane. You see here that working in normal conditions, wet conditions, chainsaws, working above certain heights and noise. Well, the last few columns are really irrelevant for us. Let me just go back, right? We're not doing any of those last 4 columns, by and large. So let's just focus on the first 2 columns. And these are good, safe guidance practices that OSHA is recommending. They fall in line with the various municipalities and NIOSH and CDC and even FEMA, right? Everybody seems to be producing a flyer on what to do, how to do it. They're all very similar. Please don't stress out about we're doing this but not this. What about that? I think you will see that many of these practices overlap in their approach. So with regard to respiratory protection, I just want to focus a little on this. It's more than just respirators, right? We also have suits, hand protection, eye protection, hard hats perhaps if you're actually removing overhead material, and proper sort of personal hygiene, leaving the job site. So everybody seems to want N95s, but I want more Tyvek and sort of impermeable suits out there. But let's focus on some of these. The N95 filtering face piece, we mentioned that. Where mold is present or known to be present, I think there's a presumption to go ahead and institute these precautions. So I guess what I'm saying is don't wait for someone to come and test your air. It's not necessary at this point. There may be a need for a higher level protection depending on the quantity of work that's done, but the consensus seems to be in the health and safety field that N95s for this level work for volunteers and homeowners is perfectly adequate. Again, the extra 5% is those very small particles of which we're not really seeing. We're seeing active spores. And of course, please, my colleagues out there and people that receive these respirators, they may seem easy to use, but there are proper and improper practices out there, including the nose clip, the checking of the seal, the bands around your head. I've seen these around people's neck. I've seen them on their heads. Let's try to use these safely because a respirator is no good unless it's being worn properly. So I encourage all of us out there to do proper training. So here's some of what we're seeing. This is all these pictures, by the way, are from the disaster back. I mentioned some of these. These are some inspectors coming in and judging. This is fairly high-level contamination. Each of those white dots is a mold culture. Once the moisture is removed, it'll stay there, releasing those spores, waiting for, like the alien, for another host. And by the way, I'm also concerned with upgrading respirators, because if we start upgrading respirators to a higher level protection, we have the dilemma, do people really wear the dual cartridge half-face respirators with the P100 filters? I've seen, unfortunately, from 9/11 days, people are given respirators and they don't wear them. So the good thing with N95s is they're relatively comfortable and the usage of them, by and large, is much higher than others. So what good is it if someone is not wearing these respirators? Also keep in mind that the other respirators, a higher level protection, may require medical determination of medical capability for using that. So here's some of my favorite picks. This is actually a commercial restoration company, not a volunteer. They have a suit. It's a combination of torn and not being zipped up. Respirator is not being worn properly. Gloves. These are nylon surgical latex surgical gloves. So there's a lot of mistakes here, and we've seen this. But by and large, this type of activity is over. I have stumbled across residents that ran to the home improvement stores and got some better respirators. I don't think they were fit tested. Hopefully they got one that fit them well, and they're using it and take good care of it. So we see that. My volunteers and my assistants doing sampling are required to wear this, both as a practice what you preach sort of thing. So when we go canvassing the neighborhoods, when we go in the building, we are also wearing this. By the way, this dark charcoal color on this respirator has some organic vapor absorption capability to it. They're not meant for organic vapor capture or certified for that, but they are odor control. So you may see those out there. They're good. And by the way, that Mona Lisa, the bottom right, is actually a mold culture growing there. I was tempted to take this home, but did not. So here you see some of the work that's ahead of us. Much of this has already been dried out. We can see on the bottom right, you could see where the water stopped because that's where the mold stopped. A bit of a capillary action above that. So very often you could actually see the mold come to a vivid end. Also on the picture on the right, on the left, you'll see the bottom has no mold because it was so wet. And only when it dries to within a particular range will mold growth really go. So again, it won't grow on water. It's just too wet. It has to be in a certain range. Some of the issues here, you notice again the wet line on the sheetrock. This is another indication that mold will follow water. Then in this particular case, after, I don't know why they put some primer on that. It looks like after they ripped out the wall, someone started painting it, and then they stopped painting it. People are doing all sorts of wacky things. But we are seeing some horrendous conditions and scary conditions on some of this, on all this. We, of course, have other hazards out there, an electrical box. Notice the water line about 2/3 of the way up on the box. This was underwater. The water in many of these areas came up and receded very quickly. Within 24 hours, some people told me almost as fast as it came in, it was drained. The subsurface is mostly sand and facilitated that, but occasionally you will have materials underwater. But this board, which looks like it's dry, still has 19% moisture in it. So the key is, are the spores going to grow first before the moisture levels go down? So it's a race. Who's going to get there first? If the moisture levels fall down, spores will stop growing. If it stays there, it will continue up. That's why we want to ventilate that space. So we have all sorts of pictures here for you. This previous picture, you could see the first 3 steps were underwater, and then, of course, mold growing. In this particular case, on porous primer paint. Flat paint, it will grow. High gloss paint, it has trouble growing, digging into that food source. But in porous materials, you do have that. Now, I'm going back to this slide, and I'm just about at the end, because these homes are attached. And when you go inside these homes, there's a common wall. So here we have a tenant an owner who removed their 2 layers of sheetrock, removed all the sound insulation, and did everything properly, but their neighbor is doing nothing. So these homes, doing the one on the left without doing the one on the right, or the middle one without either one on each side, is asking for trouble. We have a lot of problems with this in Coney Island and the Rockaways, where we have attached housing. Water also, even through the shared foundations, this can happen. So this is one of our big challenges. And there's a colleague of mine taking a moisture reading. I don't think you need a moisture meter to tell you that's pretty wet down there. So I see my time is just about up. Thank you for listening. I will hand it over to Mitch Rosen, who will guide me on answering some questions. And just want to remind you to ask your questions. Just type them in that little box.
So the first question is, what equipment do you recommend when scrubbing mold? You talked about personal protective equipment, but is there other equipment that you should be looking at?
Safety equipment? I think the big mistake I see people making is So the question is, in addition to respirators, what other equipment is a necessity? And it's a good question because everybody seems to be thousands of respirators out there. I have thousands to give. However, suits are critical. We don't want to bring this contamination home. We don't want it on our clothes. So please, if you cannot get a hold of a disposable suit, get yourself old clothing so that when you go into the job site, you have your work clothing, and before you go home, peeling this inside out, putting it in a bag, cleaning it separately, try to keep your work clothes and your regular clothing apart so we don't bring any contamination home. Short of that, eyeglasses are useful because some mold spores will cause some eye irritation. No special shoes are generally needed.
Someone from the Connecticut Department of Health has a comment about homeowners and volunteers who are asthmatic or have other chronic respiratory disease or are immunocompromised should not do the work themselves. They should get someone else.
A very good question from the Connecticut Department of Health. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. We talk about the homeowners and the residents being immunocompromised. It's very important that our volunteers are pre-screened verbally saying, do you have any of these conditions? We should not be asking these volunteers who are already donating so much of their time and money to be doing this type of work if they're at risk. And they have to be honest about it. So please, let's make sure the volunteers are safe. And the website there is www.ct.gov, connecticut.gov/DPH, Department of Public Health, /mold. So I'm sure Connecticut government, Department of Health, I'm sure there's a mold link there. Please go there because we do have homes in Connecticut that are also flooded.
So many volunteers are not doing remediation. They are simply doing the demolition and removing the demo materials. What is the minimum PPE they should be wearing? Is there any rule of thumb that they can use to determine when they have passed the limits of their PPE and need to stop working?
Okay, there's a question about sort of the muck out, the individuals that are removing the material and not doing mold. We still have this going on, sort of demolition, but not mold remediation or abatement. And at a minimum, it's a dusty environment. We are sort of encouraging, and I personally would like to insist on these volunteers wearing N95s properly fitted. If you're doing this type of work, suits are probably not necessary, protective clothing to really do this. So it's pretty much construction clothing, including gloves, perhaps a cap to keep your hair clean, because there is some overhead material that you're likely to dislodge. I think the second part of that question was, respirators. Yes, the N95s are made to be disposed. After you use it, if it's ripped or torn or bent or very dirty, throw it out properly and get yourself a new one. They are meant to be replaced. They don't really fill up. They don't lose their efficiency, but when they're that dirty, we don't want the contamination on the inside. So when they're that dirty, just get yourself a new one or work with someone in the agencies to do that. We have plenty. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming to the webinar. I've been told that this will be available online for educational purposes. Click on the same link, and you'll go back to the beginning. And I thank you for your attention, and feel free to contact UMDNJ, the Education and Resource Center, NIHS, New Jersey. Your federal agencies and governments are supportive, knowledgeable. They're out there to help us. They help me. So please go to them for guidance on this. So good luck to you, and stay safe. Goodbye.